All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for being here tonight. We are very pleased to present Read Up 2022. This year is very special because today is our 100th birthday as Richmond Public Library. Actually, today is Before we get too far into the program, I would like to ask we observe a moment of silence in honor of the students who were injured and lost their lives Sunday night at UVA. Devin Chandler, Lavelle Davis Jr., and Deshaun Perry were tragically and senselessly killed in an act of gun violence. If you'll just join me in just a moment of quiet reflection. Thank you. Our hearts and prayers go out to the UVA family and all of those who lost their lives. Today, 100 years ago, November 15, 1922, Richmond City Council passed a resolution to fund the establishment of Richmond Public Library to serve the city of Richmond. The first location was the Lewis Ginter Mansion, opened on Franklin Street near VCU. Soon after, a better, more spacious library opened on the spot where we are today. Sally Mae Dooley funded the construction of the main library on First and Franklin to honor her husband, James Dooley. Well-known and popular author James Branch Cabell donated his family home to be the spot of the city's new library. It was a home where he was born, and it was at First and Franklin. The main library has been here ever since. Our library continued to grow through the 20th century and into the 21st century. There are now 9 libraries in every neighborhood of the city. We are a library that has evolved with the city that we serve in every single way. Our library system has grown, so has the definition of literacy. While Richmonders still visit the local library to read books in a welcoming space, they also come to borrow laptops, hear live music, view art, revise their resumes, and find employment, and so much more. The library has always been the most democratic institution in our city, and it's become the most versatile too. Here's to 100 years of Richmond stories. We are looking forward to the next chapter. Join us over this next year as we celebrate our past and look with great excitement towards the next 100 years. Finally, let me thank the Richmond Public Library Foundation, the Friends of the Library who have underwritten tonight's event. Thank you to the Library Board of Trustees, City of Richmond Council, Mayor, and all of our city colleagues throughout all the different departments and administration of the city for the support that they've given our library over the last 100 years. And last but not least, thank you to Richmond Public Library staff. They are the very best at what they do, and they inform and empower everything. Now let's get on with this Read Up program. I'll turn the floor over to Clay Deshawn, our Deputy Director, who will introduce one of our speakers tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott, and thank you all for coming out on this evening. We've been looking forward to this all year, pretty much. And it's always this is our 4th year, but only the 2nd time that we've been able to do it in person, but because of the COVID interlude, I'll say. But just want to thank again, echo Scott's statements and say thank you to the staff that's worked so hard to make this happen. And your efforts have been tremendous, and I'm grateful to you all for it. I'll introduce our host for the evening. Dr. Njelle Hamilton is Associate Professor of English and Africana Studies at the University of Virginia. She holds degrees from the University of the West Indies and Brandeis University, the latter of which she received both her Master of Arts and Doctorate of Philosophy. She serves as book review editor of Anthurium Caribbean Studies Journal. She is the author of a monograph entitled Phonographic Memories, Popular Music and a Contemporary Caribbean Novel, published by Rutgers in 2019. Dr. Hamilton specializes in 20th and 21st century Caribbean literary and cultural studies, with particular focus on narrative theory and fiction craft. Her essays on sound studies, trauma theory, and the physics of time have appeared in Anthurium, Journal of West Indian Literature, SX Salon, and Critical Perspectives on Indo-Caribbean Women's Literature, while her short fiction has been published in Centripetal and Pre-Lit. She is working on 2 projects currently, a novel and a second monograph titled The Physics of Caribbean Time, which embraces storytelling as a method informed to explore the alternative clocks and narrative forms that might more accurately render how Caribbean people experience time. Likewise, she has written critically of our featured author, Marlon James, publishing Ja Live, Messianic Time and Post-Traumatic Narrative Disorder, and Marlon James is a brief history of 7 killings. In addition to these sterling attributes and accomplishments, Dr. Hamilton is possessed with a most lovely singing voice. It is my great pleasure to welcome her as our host this evening for this 4th incarnation of Read Up Richmond, Dr. Njelle Hamilton.
Thank you all. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Read Up Richmond. Thank you, the Richmond Public Library System. Thank you all for coming. I'm very delighted to be hosting what I'm sure will be a lively conversation with the wonderful Marlon James. So before I introduce Marlon, I hope you permit me to take a moment to acknowledge, like you did earlier, the devastating news of the past few days. I'm coming in right now from Charlottesville, from University of Virginia. And you know, you've heard the news, and so my body is here, but my heart is heavy. We're thinking of these students who were our students, among them students in my current class and in our majors. And so I want to hold them up, their families up in our prayers. There's 2 students who are still nursing injuries. And so I just want to name their names again: Devin Chandler, Lavelle Davis Jr., who was one of our majors in Africana Studies, Deshaun Perry, who was a student in my current class, Roots, Writing, and Reggae, and of course their parents, their family, their friends, their classmates. In fact, Sunday evening, Deshaun and a group of students submitted just a stunningly beautiful audiovisual research project, a group project on the assassination attempt on Marley's life, which was the kind of the central subject of Marlon's book, A Brief History of 7 Killings. So I've just been replaying, there's a kind of 5 minutes of his voice. It's kind of with his part of the citation, and we've just been listening to that. We're very grateful to have his voice. We're very grateful to all the technologies that allow us to kind of keep a little bit of them. We hold their memories with us. So thank you for allowing me to talk a little bit about them. And so both Marlon and I hail from a same small country, a small island in the Caribbean Ocean, but with outsized international impact, right? And among the reasons for that is sort of, we have great authors, right? We are kind of a really incredible literary island, right? Like a long literary tradition, a long musical tradition, so music and literature, as well as kind of really amazing writers. And so I'll tell you a little bit about Marlon, and this is only a small bit of his many, many accomplishments. Marlon James is the 2018 recipient of the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Literature. And he's been named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in 2019. I don't know how that works, but that's a big deal. I don't know. I guess so.
Good to go to a party with Taylor Swift.
Yes. Born in Jamaica in 1970, James is the author of 5 award-winning novels, as well as numerous short stories and essays. His first novel, John Crow's Devil, tells the story of a biblical struggle in a remote Jamaican village in the 1950s. Though rejected 70-something times,
78, but who's counting?
something plenty times before being accepted for publication. John Crow's Devil went on to become a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and the Commonwealth Writers Prize, as well as New York Times Editor's Choice. His second novel, The Book of Night Women, is about a slave woman's revolt on a Jamaican plantation in the early 19th century. The novel won the 2010 Dayton Literary Peace Prize, Minnesota Book Award. It was a finalist for the 2010 National Book Critics Circle Award in Fiction, as well as an NAACP Image Award. He followed this up with a brief history of 7 killings, which won, of course, the 2015 Man Booker Prize for Fiction, a big deal, apparently. So yeah, this is a big deal. It's a big deal because the Man Booker Prize, which is not the Booker Prize, it was one of the few places that international authors, non-American authors, could be recognized. And so, of course, the Americans have taken it over now, which is a whole other thing. But it was also a big deal because Marlon was the first Jamaican writer to win this major prize. The novel also won the American Book Award, the Anisfield Wolf Book Prize, the OCM Booker's Prize for Caribbean Literature, and many, many others. And this novel, of course, explores Jamaican history, but through the perspective of multiple narratives and genres, a political thriller, oral biography, the classic whodunit, and in my mind also through kind of reggae and dancehall music, right through the musical lens, kept telling though a story of Jamaica in the 1970s, a new kind of historiography that kind of was centered around this assassination attempt on reggae musician Bob Marley. Of course, his best-selling book, apparently, this is what your press people said.
Oh, really?
So I don't know if that's the latest, but his best-selling book, Black Leopard, Red Wolf, is the first in the Dark Star trilogy. And somebody please ask him about when the next one's coming out. He should get the George R.R. Martin treatment where all his next one should be left me hanging on a thread. It's the first in the Dark Star trilogy, which is a fantasy series set in African legend. Black Leopard received the Ray Bradbury Prize for Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Speculative Fiction from the Los Angeles Times Book Prizes. Also 2020 Locus Award for Horror.
Mhm.
It was a finalist for the 2019 National Book Award in the fiction category. It was named one of the Washington Post's 10 best books for 2019. It's a big deal. The second book in the trilogy, Moon Witch Spider King, which is my favorite of his, among many favorites, was an instant New York Times bestseller. Is that true?
I hear that, yeah.
Okay. And so the third book apparently will be titled White Wing Dark Star.
Mhm.
All right. And are you still writing it? Still working
I'm still working on it.
All right. So we should nag him about it.
Yeah.
All the deets about all the deets.
Well, my poetry thing's just coming out in 24, so.
Well, they're not far because your publisher said that Moon would come out in 2021, and it
Mhm.
was only a year off. So
A year off,
months off.
Mhm.
Months off.
Mhm.
So how is it going? Are you close to the end?
Oh, God, no. Absolutely not. Not even remotely near that.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit perhaps about your writing process, but I actually
Right.
wanted to start about you as a reader.
Mhm.
So I grew up in a bookstore in Jamaica, so I had a lot of access to books. I read a lot. I wonder what was your childhood like, and how did you
Yeah.
come to reading?
I didn't grow up with easy access to books. It's not that there weren't books in the house. My mom was a cop and my dad was a lawyer, and there were books in the house. My father wasn't really a prose guy at all. He really loved the metaphysical poets. Actually, no, he didn't. He liked the romantic poets. He hated the metaphysical poets. So Coleridge and Coleridge again, which is a very Jamaican thing. When you listen to a lot of old Jamaican stuff like Louise Bennett, after a while you're hearing Coleridge. Certainly Claude McKay. After a while, you're hearing Coleridge. So there was a lot of poetry in house. There was Kyle Gibran, The Prophet, which I read because there were naked pictures in it. I was like 8. And my mom had 2 things. She had short story collections like O. Henry, but she also used to get these Reader's Digest used to do these things where they compile excerpts from short stories and novels, and like hundreds of them, and she'd have those. Which is why I even know every now and then I'll come across a novel and I go, oh, and I know this thing. I read it in Reader's Digest. So it's not like there weren't a lot of books, but also they didn't encourage me to read anything, but they didn't stop me either. And so there was that. And as always, you know, reading books everybody else wasn't interested in. If there's a book in my friend's house and nobody cared about it, I'll pick it up and read it.
Like, what were some of those titles, do you remember?
Man, I wish they were lofty, but they weren't. Certainly Hollywood Wives.
Oh.
Oh man, I love that book. You don't want to know how old I was. I was definitely younger than 13. I read that book in one sitting. And I remember I'm like, but I think it was 13. I read it in one sitting. I started at 2 p.m. and finished it around 6 a.m. the next day. I closed that book and go, I'm a man. I know everything. Yeah, so but I've always books were it was weird. It was also like a kind of contraband for me. Like 100 Years of Solitude I came across because somebody was reading it at UA in a Spanish lit class. So I know they shouldn't be reading it in English. So I use it as my justification for stealing it. I'm like, yeah, when you come back to class looking for this book, it won't be here, and you shouldn't have had it in the first place. Because you're not supposed to be reading English translations of books in a Spanish lit class. So I relieved whoever that was of the book and went home, and I was like, it was like I was always in a black and white movie, and suddenly somebody go, here's color. I was stunned by that book. Somebody read some of my old stuff I wrote and said, you need to read Salman Rushdie's Shame. And I read that book and I remember being so appalled. Because I, even though I went to school in the 80s, it was still a very British colonial education. I went to Wolmer's boys' school, which is very lofty kind of school. But in the 80s, it was still a British colonial education. You're also taught to revere the author. Like when we got exam papers, the teacher always said, defend the author, defend the author. You know how hard that is when you're trying to defend Chaucer? No disrespect, well, yeah, disrespect. I can't stand Chaucer. But anyway, I grew up looking at literature as something to endure or something to get over and so on. And to read a book, I forget which book I was talking about now.
Shame.
Shame, yeah, but to read a book that not only broke form, but laughed at form. Because there are parts of Shame that are deliberately verbose. Because I can bet at some point somebody told Salman, you're writing too verbosely. And he said, instead of clipping myself and editing myself, so I'm just another VH ball, I'm going to go the other direction. I'm going to make it even worse. And I was like, you can't do that. You can't do that. The things he did in that book, saying things like, I can't remember now, it would be like, Marlon James, who I shall kill off on page 20, walked down the street. I'm like, no, you can't. Then I flipped to page 20, of course he's dead. And I didn't know that the novel was a space for fun. Or even a space for exploration. I thought a novel was a space for, here is the formula. Okay, it is a formula. And you stick to it. And so yeah, it was, that's why I really suck at careers day. Because I have it was just such a random thing. A huge influence on me were all these novelizations of sci-fi movies. I remember the first time I saw Empire Strikes Back. I'm like, Empire Strikes Back, Star Wars marathon, let's do it. I've seen this movie 1,000,000 times. I can recite the dialogue. I'm watching this movie and I go, I've never seen this. And I realized I hadn't seen it. I read the novelization of it. Because that you can find in Jamaica pretty easy. Some pharmacy somewhere, Star Trek Wrath of Khan. No, a movie. And a huge part of my cinema language was actually fiction. It was actually
as well.
Yeah, it's very easy to get Superman 3 as a book because it's selling for like 20 cents because nobody in their right mind would read it, but me. And to this day, I kind of want to meet Alan Dean Foster. He's a guy who does the thankless job of writing these books that are going to end up at some pharmacist sale somewhere. Which is to say, overall, that it was just sort of everything but the kitchen sink. You know, I read, the only category I needed for a book was that it was next. And I think that's why I also don't have a sort of snobbish attitude to books.
Yeah.
I don't have a literary hierarchy.
Which is also a very post-colonial thing, right? The
Yeah.
or curriculum palettes.
Well, yeah,
Just
because,
random,
yeah.
The kinds of things you put together, so
Mhm.
I was thinking of Leopard, alongside Shakespeare, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think we're all the better for it. Because I think what happened, I mean, I read the stuff I write when I was only guided by how I learned English literature in high school, which thank God college took out of me. But I don't think I now read sometimes novels written in Jamaica where I can tell this person only went to high school.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, you actually still think we can put betwixt in a sentence in a novel set in 2022? Like, no, we don't get to do that anymore. Yeah.
Well, so there's the novels and the work that you read in school, but you're talking a little bit here about kind of contraband. So what was reading for you? What was it that you looked for perhaps in the books that were not on syllabi that you found?
You know what? I mean, at one point I was looking for fun and sex. Remember, a teenager. But then I realized I was looking to be surprised and not necessarily by plot. Because I remember really enjoying Tom Jones, and really enjoying Alex Garland's The Beach. Really enjoying Kingsley, Martin Amos's London Fields. Really enjoying The Color Purple. And I think with what all these books did was, it was yet another book that made me go, oh, you can do that? Metamorphosis blew my mind. I was like, hold on, you can do that? It's just weird because I don't want to paint a picture that the books I were reading were bad books, because Victorian literature is still a huge influence on me. But I think the problem with how it's taught is that you start to rank literature. And you start to, you start to have this idea of what makes good literature. I remember I was judging the Commonwealth short story, and the obvious choice from everybody was yet another British woman, and yet another middle-class British woman experiences ennui, the end. It's like, are we really gonna do this again? But then the story that me and Jeet Tayal, who's from India, were fighting for, is a story from Jennifer. What's Jennifer's surname? Whatever. I can't remember her surname. She's from Uganda. And the story is called Let's Tell This Story Properly. And the thing about the story is that the story always sort of self-destructs and starts up again. Because somebody goes, this is not the story. Let's tell the story properly. Which is very much a kind of call and response when like African music and African derived music come about. And that's what she was doing. She was literally doing call and response. So I literally had to stop the judging to explain call and response and understand that, what we can, when Black people signify and how we do sound and echo, and that to tell a story, especially in a non-Western way, doesn't necessarily mean beginning, middle, and end. It can be middle done 15 times until they kind of got, either they got it or they got tired of fighting us. But yeah, I think the all those influences that was thrust upon us where we went looking for end up shaping, literature. Because if I didn't go to and read particularly literature in translation,
right?
Because when you're studying Caribbean literature, you tend to think only people speaking English wrote literature. So Maurice Condé was a shock. Because I'm like, man, I want a novel, I want an African wolf hall, I want something that I realized she wrote Sigurd years before that. And a novel like Sigurd is just, it's so important. It's so important and it remains so important because there are very few books like it.
Do you remember, was it a particular novel or a particular moment that you said, I want to be a writer, or was that?
Oh, there are quite a few of them. The very first one, funny enough, was Little House in the Big Woods, Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Yeah.
I read that, I go, I want to write books.
Why? Why?
I think because I weird enough kind of empathize with the characters, which is saying something because she's such a racist. It's like there are no redeeming factors with Laura. Yeah, but you know, I also read it at the right time because it was the first book I read. I think I was making the transition from books with pictures to book without pictures, and I was not having it. It struck me as the dumbest idea ever. Why would you have a book without pictures? That makes no sense. It's like, why? I remember reading, and mom would ask, "Oh, you like it?" I go, "Well, there are no pictures." But I get to the end. You liked it? Yeah, I liked it. There are no pictures. but then again, okay, I can write a book without pictures, I guess. So that was one. Another big one was Jessica Hagedorn's Dog Eaters. And I read that book in around, I think, 1989 or 90. And I remember thinking, this is the best book about Jamaica I've ever read. And it's set in the Philippines. And then I realized if you're writing about Manila or Cape Town or Mexico City or Maracaibo, you're writing about Jamaica. You're writing about Kingston. It's the same kind of city. It's like when you land in New Orleans and I go, oh yeah. I was like, dude, I saw that con coming a mile away. You think you can con me? I'm from Jamaica. And you know, like one of the there's so many crazy things about that book and about that Jamaicans would understand. Like in that place, if you're in Manila or Mexico City or even in Kingston, you always seem to be somewhere between a political election and a beauty contest. And that's exactly what happened in this book. It's a clash of basically politicians and beauty queens. And I know a lot of beauty queens in Jamaica who married politicians. Not business, so they're good friends of mine. Or became one. And just this sort of the craziness of a country chafing against its colonial past, and how that reckoning is sometimes ridiculously hilarious, sometimes quite nightmarish. So it's how crazy it is that the person who wins the beauty contest pulls off her clothes and goes, I'm a radical comunista, down with the revolution. You know, another guy is walking on the street just talking about what an easy day it is, and then a bullet hits his head and he's instantly dead. And the unpredictability, the violence, but also the beauty and the terror and the ridiculousness. It was a book that made me, a book about Philippines that made me think, oh wait, I can write about Jamaica as it is.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm thinking a lot, we can talk about, your first novel, because those terms seem to describe, I mean, not just John Crow's Devil, but your entire work, I think, right? So the beauty, the grit, the violence, the excess, all of that, right? So to write about Jamaica requires writing about all of this.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about kind of the process of writing the first novel. If you remember, it was a while back.
It was a while back. Well, the first novel I wrote, I didn't even write it to be published. I wrote it because my previous life, I was an art director. I was Sean Paul's art director for a while. We're gonna relive the glory days.
Dance hall flyers.
I know. We're gonna relive the glory days in a couple of days. I'm interviewing him, which is gonna be hilarious. So we went to high school together as well. We didn't talk to each other in high school.
I can imagine.
Yeah, couldn't cross the class line. But so I was doing a lot of copywriting, advertising, doing a lot of sort of corporate type of stuff. And I went back to fiction because I wanted something creative that was mine. And I think at some point when I finished it, I'm like, well, if you're gonna finish it, I'll be might as well try to sell it or at least get people to read it. And that was a whole other ordeal. But I wrote it by hand and I will never do that again.
Well, no, you can't, now because, now there are, 700 pages to final draft, so you probably should.
Yeah, I don't know if I could write it. My books are not short. You see, I've noticed. And I like to write at the speed at which I think. And I really can't hold a thought very long. But that novel, it was of course it was first, it's the only novel that was written without that expectation or anticipation or any tone set by a novel before it. So I felt, and as I said, I really wrote it for me. And although I do think if you're gonna write a good novel, you should write it for yourself. First and foremost, you have to write it for yourself. So yeah, I know at the time I was also struggling as a queer guy and also deeply religious. Because I actually joined church pretty late. I'm not one of those people who grew up in church. I ran to church at 28.
Oh.
Yeah, I was like, Jesus, please make me straight. That's a whole other side interview. But then I started to write about John Crow's Devil, and I mean, people who've been in church would know only a church guy could have written that book. That there's certain things in it that only church people know. It's like I remember somebody talking to me, they're trying to come at me at all angles, but Marlon, no weapon. But yes, sister, no weapon. Because of course, in church, the whole sentence. If you're not in church, sorry. But it was also, again, the sort of chafing against church. It was also, again, realizing what happens when you completely erase intellectual life from church, which is something that I was starting to feel in my church. That there, people say, I don't have a PhD, but I have a GOD. And I'd be like, God gave it the intelligence to get a PhD. It's like, but it's the clash against that kind of religion, and I'm of two minds about it because I also think that some of these things that are called cults in Jamaica weren't cults, but I also think some of
African retention,
right.
Yeah.
But Kai Miller is a wonderful novel called Augustine,
Beautiful book.
where he opens up that whole Bedouin cult thing. I said, what if it wasn't a cult? What if it was actually Black self-determination?
Part of the emancipation.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And what if, and I remember as I said to Kai, my first novel would have been different than I read your novel first. But those are some of the things that went into it. But it was also me processing queerness. And in a weird way, we were talking earlier before how I said I waited until I was my age now to read Giovanni's Room. Because I don't think I could have handled it. If I were 20, I think it would have definitely sent me back in the closet. And the reason why I bring up Giovanni's Room, not that this book is anywhere in the league of Giovanni's Room, is that Giovanni's Room, weirdly enough, is also a homophobic novel.
Mm-hmm.
And there is that sort of thing, the homophobic novel written by a homosexual. Yeah. And I do think in its way, John Crow's Devil is a homophobic novel. Which is funny because my editor at the time called me in and he was really nervous. It's like, I just wanna. He's like, I don't know if you have a problem with gay people. And I was like, damn, he really isn't reading the room. And he mentioned some parts, and I actually pulled back. So which is why I don't think if you read it, you necessarily think this is a homophobic novel, because I took it out. I took all those things out. Just that in my head, I know the place I was coming from was sort of self-homophobic. So and that's always it's and a lot of times writers don't pull it off. Like, are you writing a sexist character or did you write a sexist book? Yes, I just mentioned nearly every contemporary white male writer in the post-war period. Did you write
subconscious?
Right. Is the book with racist or a racist book? Like I think, some books like maybe Disgrace, where I could say didn't quite cross the line, he thinks it did. So there is all of that that's in there, and it was stuff I was working out. I use it now to do it. And if you had asked me that question 10 years ago, I'd have said, absolutely not, how dare you try to read me in my books. So I'm like, hell yeah.
Well, there's there's a way in which, we were talking about this earlier too,
Mhm.
that there's a way in which your other novel, Book of Night Women, the characters, I mean, it's a neo-slave narrative, it's in a plantation,
Yeah.
enslaved peoples, and they made really kind of horrific homophobic statements,
Mhm.
right? And then in the epic, a brief history,
Mhm.
their characters were gay, were self-hating.
Mhm.
Gay. And so there's a way in which your novels seem to kind of trot, especially the Jamaican novels,
Mhm.
right? Kind of thinking about what does it mean to write honestly about the place that
Yeah.
is
Yeah,
violently homophobic
Yeah.
in many ways.
it is. Although if a lot of the characters in those novels, they really internalize it.
Yeah.
Brief History was interesting. I think Brief History made Black Leopard happen.
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, in a sense, I didn't think about it until somebody told me, somebody who actually writes on my stuff. Because I like to think my novels have nothing in common with each other. And yeah, when Weeper goes to America,
Yeah.
and it's not just that he is in gay relationships and he's sort of freer. He's not that free. He has these wild ideas that Air Jamaica is going to fly right past his window, and everybody in the plane will go, there he is, even though no plane can do that. If your plane is that close to your window, somebody's going to die. But even with him, but he gets looser and the prose gets looser.
Yeah. And is it because they're in America? So the moment
Actually,
that section opens, right, with them in America, and it's a Weaver
Mhm.
chapter where
Yeah.
for the first time he's and not able to enjoy his relationship. I mean, he's still struggling.
He's
but
still struggling.
at
but
least on the page you're going there,
Mhm.
which you hadn't I think before.
Yeah, and some of that, of course, is experience, just be me myself as well. But I do think it's a freer narrative, and it's also as very big on he's not going to die because he's gay.
Right.
And I mean, gay characters still die in my books,
Mhm.
but I wasn't going to jump in that whole die because you're a gay thing, because I'm so tired of that. And it's still happening in a lot of stories, even especially on TV. But that's the freeness that allowed me to then write somebody like Tracker. It was definitely a kind of an evolution.
Yeah. Talk to me perhaps about how winning the Booker.
Mhm.
Did that change your process, your craft? Did it give you permission in a way that you didn't have before, or did you just?
Not really. I mean, I started researching Black Leopard in 2014 before Brief History came out, because I usually when I have a book out, I'm already somewhere into the next one, so that my headspace is far gone already, so I don't have to deal with the craziness of putting out a book. But I don't know. I didn't think it didn't have any pressure on me at all, honestly. I remember going to my agent and saying, I have two ideas for a book. I have this really practical, sensible one that that I think would be pretty much a kind of a logical follow-up to Brief History. And then I have this book with like a shape-shifting leopard in it. And she was like, well, I saw how your eyes lit up when you talked about the shape-shifting leopard. It's like, I think you should write that one. It's like, yeah, I figured you'd say so. That's why I'm already 200 pages in. Yeah, I just still believe you should write a book that excites you. I don't think you should write a book that you think you should write. That's always, William Burroughs talks about that. There should be no should in literature. And I believe that as well. So the sensible thing would have been to just write another book like Brief History, or write a sequel or something. And you know what? I mean, nothing in my life as a writer has ever made sense. So why start now?
One of the things that, not because of the book, but because Brief History was 680 pages, a 23-hour audiobook, and counting.
Yeah. It's like, we do a lot of cheating with my books.
Yeah.
So we're like, little finer prints, and we widen the margin a little bit so people don't think the books are figures there, but then they're still heavy.
They're heavy.
So-
Yeah. But I was thinking about, the earlier novels were quite shorter. Did you want to write kind of an epic in scale and
I mean,
scope?
kind of. The funny thing with Brief History is that Brief History was supposed to be my shortest book. Because I was reading all these crime novellas, and I'm like, man, I love this. Get in, get out, bang, bang, some blood, you're done, 180 pages, yes. And I was reading, lots of Jim Thompson, I was reading Jean-Patrick Manchet, I was reading all this French crime noir, and like, man, the French really know how to do it. And I started writing this book about this hitman from Chicago having boyfriend issues, trying to kill this Jamaican who may or may not have been involved in the Marley assassination attempt. And I just couldn't finish it. And I said, okay, fine, I'll just write a different book. And I started on another one, which is going to be my big novella. And I couldn't finish that either. And I kept writing these books that I couldn't finish until I did it with my friend Rachel, who's not with us anymore. And Rachel said, why do you think it's one person? I said, I don't know whose story this is. And she's like, why do you think it's one person's story? And she sent me back to read As I Lay Dying, the Faulkner novel. And that was the epiphany that, wow, it's not a one person book, it's many people. And the good thing is I already had like 300 pages of failed novellas that became that novel. So I didn't set out to write a big book with that one. At the same time, I knew if I was going to tell a story about any point in Jamaica, and I'm really telling 15 years, if that long, 76 to 92. I don't know. Around 15, 16 years. That you can't be just one story. Even the Bob Marley event thing happened almost organically. But I knew if you're going to tell a story about any time in Jamaica, you can't just use one person.
Yeah, and I mean, it's multiple narratives, but it's only about 5 or 6 days, like individual days.
Yeah, they're individual days. Yeah.
Full. The idea of the brief history.
Yeah. Well, that's one. And also, I was reading a lot of Virginia Woolf. People were surprised when I tell them my influences because I never seasoned my work. I was reading tons of Mrs. Dalloway when I was writing brief history. Particularly the middle section, I think I think it's the 1979 section where everybody's listening to the same Andy Gibbs song.
Yeah.
In it, shadow dancing plays twice on the radio, and it's what happens when that song is playing twice. And but I was like, shadow dancing, Virginia Woolf makes perfect sense to me. Well, it was Mrs. Dalloway I was reading. And I don't necessarily think what I wrote was stream of consciousness, but I do think it was very much about the immediacy of the moment. And yes, the rest of the chapters I like that, but you're right, each chapter is pretty much one day.
I mean, I'm thinking about some of the gunmen, like Bam Bam, the younger one. I mean, and we've talked about and I've written about sort of trauma in your work, and those moments felt sort of your way of kind of finding a form for trauma. Both with language, both with form. I mean, there are moments that the prose becomes kind of poetry on the page, and
because I think if you there are aspects of there's stories you want to tell that sometimes just burst against the form. I think that's why we have reggae music to begin with. And it says something that for a lot of writers like me, like Kai, like Colin Channer, what's Marcia's surname again? Right, Marcia Douglas, that it was a lot of ways reggae was the way in. Because reggae was a way to speak patois, to speak Jamaican English, not always the same thing. To talk about serious issues. Because yes, sometimes if you're doing a Louise Bennett poem, I mean, Louise was smart, and there's a lot of irony underneath all of that, but sometimes it's also slapstick. I know, because in my early readings, when people hear me burst out the quarter, they go, we're going to have fun tonight. And then my stories just got darker and darker and darker.
So the history of either using certain registers of patois.
Right.
Always a comedic.
Always comedic. Yeah. And the idea that you can stay in a language that comes out of your mouth and talk about serious things. For a lot of us, it was reggae that showed us how to do that.
And to get an international audience while staying true to that, did you have trouble publishing, or did editors give you
Yes and
trouble?
no. I mean, Book of Night Woman nearly didn't get published in the UK because a publisher that really had a lot of experience in Caribbean literature and Black literature read it. And a publisher that shall remain nameless, Viking. And the editor said she was really, really impressed with it. She thinks it's really, whatever. She really, really liked it, but she doesn't think there's a future for this book in Britain and the rest of the world. And would I reconsider writing it in
So wait,
not in
so
English?
Britain and the rest of the world,
So we get into that part.
so
So I was like, you don't have an empire anymore. You don't get to say Britain and the rest of the world anymore. Like I'm actually more offended by that than by your rejection letter. So and you can't call it Commonwealth, whatever the hell that is. Like, no, Britain and the rest of the world. It's like, okay. It's like, no, you don't get to say that. But again, I said, so you want me to turn a novel about slavery into a Jane Austen novel? The truth is, I actually tried to write it that way at first, and I only got to page 40. And then I said, no wonder Huckleberry Finn is an American novel. But yeah, I ran into that in places I wouldn't have expected to.
Right.
I know when I told all the Jamaicans what I was writing and how I was writing it, they're like, aren't you an English professor? So there's still this idea that Jamaican patois is broken English, which implies that it needs to be fixed. And weird enough, the receptive ears that I got were American.
is it, you think, because the vernacular tradition between?
I think because of the vernacular tradition, and I think because of some books like Color Purple wouldn't have happened in the UK.
Right.
The UK, I mean, there are novels that wouldn't have happened here. Half of the Indian and Indian descendant novels that happen in the UK wouldn't have happened here. London Stanley had to be translated for America. So I'm not letting America off the hook. But yeah, but I had a more receptive ear here. I've never had somebody say fix this or fix that. Mind you, I don't write phonetically.
Right.
Like I'm not gonna write CYAAN because everybody's gonna go, what's a cyan?
Right. And was it an early choice, or as you're
It was an early
experimenting?
choice for me because I realized that all I want to make sure is that I still have the rhythm. I don't really care how the word is spelled. I just want to make sure I still have the rhythm right and the rules right, because patois has rules. That's what people don't realize. I work on screenplays with a lot of people trying to write Jamaica, and it's all awful.
The famous Brad Pitt moment.
It's oh God, Stella got her back. Stella, I can't change in 20. Yeah. Stella, hey, you know what? That movie made me gay, so it's fine. Because I went on a straight date, and both me and the girl were like, yeah. I went, yeah. They're like, yeah? Like, yeah. God, I got this totally distracted with my Stella. No, but it's because I had to teach them, stop trying to do it by vocabulary because you're going to get it wrong. Patois has rules, just like anything else.
Present tense is something I learned from your fiction, right? That how to, so that editors will try to, or copy editors try to flag it as incorrect.
Right.
But your novels really kind of establish and affirm the grammatical rules, and you set them really early, and they sustain in a really big way. And I've heard you talk about that. That's especially with the fantasy trilogy that you kind of thinking about how this relates to kind of African languages and so on.
Yeah, because I, again, as much as I am championing Jamaican patois, still had these ideas about it. Like one of the things about patois is verbs are almost always present tense. There's no went in Jamaican English. Him did go. Him did go, him soon go, him won't go, him care go, even he going go. Yeah.
And depending on which parts of Jamaica,
Yeah.
you don't go.
Yeah. Kude, queer. My mother used to say queer. Like, Man, you had QI in it, QUI. It's like, but to come back to the whole thing about present tense verbs, so we just saw again part of broken English. But if you look at languages like Wolof, the verb is always present tense. So it's not that we're having some sort of Jamaican inferior moment. It's just another moment that the slave ship couldn't kill. And that there are these grand moments of pure Africanness that always stun Ghanaians and Nigerians when they come to Jamaica.
Mhm.
It's like they're just flipping. What? You still say that?
Yeah.
You know, yeah, I'm Ghanaian. That's it. They're like, you still said yeah. I was like, but that's a more complicated idea of how African structure still stays in how we how we talk or express. The idea that action is always active.
Mhm.
That if you're gonna go into action, make it as active and visceral as you can, which is to keep it present tense. So so as I said, nobody went anywhere in Jamaica. Him did go. Him can't go. Him won't go. Him soon go. Him going go. Him not go. Oh, that's what I hear. Him go. Him go. Yeah.
Complex.
I love when they put it together, man. Him go. Yeah. Nah, go. So, but it's the resilience of these African tongues that still shape how. I mean, English would put the words in our mouth, but African languages show what we do with our tongues.
I mean, I was interested. I felt, I don't know if this is just me as a Jamaican reader, but for me, not so much Black Leopard, but Moonwitch, especially Sagalon, not only Sagalon, but a lot of the STC sections read very much like Jamaican speech. Was that intentional, or were you thinking?
It was kind of intentional, kind of not. I mean, I was reading a lot of Pidgin. And Pidgin and Patois are very similar in some key ways. Like I think they would say something like, "You there go." Which some Jamaicans would say. We use dialect that a little bit.
It's like Manchester, West, like the middle part of Jamaica.
Yeah.
The mountains.
Yeah, so they'll have lines like that. But I think it did slide into a kind of a Jamaican, because I'm still Jamaican. And she speaks a kind of a patois, which, as I say, I tried to make it closer to Pidgin, but it probably still ended up Jamaican. Certainly a Jamaican sensibility to it.
I had a sense as well, and I was thinking about the first three books set in Jamaica. It's largely brief history. The last part, all of the characters, the main characters migrate and end up in the U.S. And then now you're on this African epic fantasy. Is there a sense for you that you're done with your Jamaican story?
Oh God, no! Oh Lord, no! Especially in the past 20, 30 years. I'm shooting this show. It's funny. I went to I was at UA a few years ago, and I met with a queer LGBT Students Association, and I was ready. I had my It Better speech, which I really worked on. And I'm giving this speech, and at 1 minute in, they're like, "We don't want to hear that shit. Do you know Beyonce?"
Broad as Spain.
Yeah, and it blew my mind. I think I nearly cried because here was a generation of queer Jamaican kids who were like, "No, I reserve the right to think about things teenagers think about. I reserve the right to have the biggest conflict in my life right now is Rihanna versus Beyonce. Not will I be killed if I walk down the street." And that shocked me. I'm writing this TV show, and it's a huge trans woman presence in it. And all the trans characters are Jamaican.
Oh.
And they're all trans women.
Is this the Get Millie Back?
Yeah, they're all Jamaican, they're all trans women. And I actually met them in a nightclub. I didn't even meet them on set. They all came over, and they're like, "Wow, this is not even a gay club." I was like, which is like the Jamaican records to turn into some paradise overnight. But I am saying that the country has made so many changes and gone through so much in the past, like since a brief history ends, that I actually can't wait to go back to write about it. So Jamaica it's Jamaica punches above its weight in so many ways, including you just can't forget the damn place. Yeah, so it's definitely you can never be done with Jamaica as a subject.
So why then the turn to African? It was so there are many sort of conspiracy theories and
Really, I haven't heard any.
and you've debunked some and then kind of I don't know if you
Really?
backtracked or whatever. But there's the first conspiracy theory that this was an African Game of Thrones.
Oh, I started that one.
Okay. But then I've heard other origin stories. So
Yeah, the
what's
African, so the African,
What's the version?
so honestly, the African Game of Thrones thing, I said it to this magazine, Man of the World, which I thought nobody read. And I still think nobody read it except people who work in media. And it just took off to the point where George R. Martin calls me and says, I hear you're writing an African version of my book. Say, no, but if you want to blurb it. He didn't, but we did an event together afterwards, so it was cool.
Yeah.
So that was, that did happen. But in front of the origin stuff, I always said is that if you're gonna make rock and roll, sooner or later you're gonna have to come to the blues. And for me, I knew I had to come back to an origin. I didn't research this novel to write a novel. I researched this novel because I realized I didn't know my mythologies.
Right.
And I'm a big believer that you should know your myths. Because myths were facts at one point.
Yeah.
And I gave this speech a few years ago at Oxford, the Tolkien lecture. And it was about mythologies and what it means when you can take your mythologies for granted. And the mythology I brought up was King Arthur. If you, not that the average British person walks around thinking about Guinevere and Lancelot or anything every day. But King Arthur allows for almost a prehistoric idea of of British sophistication, British civilization, British gallantry, and the whole idea that they were always Britannia. Except that place was
a sense of space and land and territory.
Absolutely. Except that place was the worst backwater in Europe. They were stunningly backward. I mean, even at the height of the Roman Empire, they were pretty prehistoric, a backward, just senseless race. And it's come on, when the Romans got to London, Britain, they were appalled. Yeah. So this idea that this backwater place develops such an air of superiority, which of course then becomes a problem, particularly when we get to the Empire and Commonwealth. But the mythology, but the point being that the mythology creates this kind of emotional history.
And it's dateless, right? I mean,
it's dateless, and because of that, it's timeless. And I'm not that I was trying to come up with a myth to delude myself, but I kept thinking, the myth is the real lyrical history of a people, and what does it mean when you don't have it? And that's why I went back to that stuff, because some of that I knew. Some of we spent a good time with African history in our history class. Thank God for the new historians at UAE. But I knew folklore, but I didn't know a lot of that stuff. I was reading all that stuff just to know.
It felt like a novel.
I was like, God damn it, this novel writing itself.
Because a lot of Caribbean writers would either begin with Anansi tales, but set in the Caribbean, like post-plantation. This that in a sense that it came from Africa, but this is where we start. The plantation as the first story.
Yeah.
You didn't do that. You didn't. I mean, Anansi is everywhere.
Yeah.
Of course, particularly the first book and the second book of the trilogy. But you didn't start with the plantation or the slave ship.
Not for this. I didn't want it there. I didn't want plantation. I didn't want slave ship. I didn't even want Islamic Africa. I want to go even further back. I also wanted the kind of novel where if you were from that period, this wouldn't be a fantasy novel to you. It's like if you take somebody from 1920s, 30s, 40s, straight up Yoruba and give them 100 years of solitude, they're going to ask, where is the magic? And they should. And to me, that's what I was trying to write with those books, where yes, there's a lot of fantasy and so on, but it wouldn't be fantasy for somebody from that period. And that's why,
Approach it with honesty, authenticity. In a trilogy that's all about versions
Yeah.
and who do you believe,
Mhm.
right? But on the
But even
page,
that
you
is-
approach it with a kind of honesty and
Yeah, but even that is African in the sense of, well, I mean, it's one of the things that we actually took over in Jamaica, where I will tell you a story, you know, and then you said, what is it, Jack Mandora, I'm not choose none, which was just basically to bring that in standard English. I just told you a story. Did you believe me? No, tell me another one. So the idea that the burden of truth in a story was on the listener, which is a huge part of the oral tradition. And when you start to research stuff like an African narrative, you realize just how much, certainly for me, how much I had underestimated oral storytelling. And just how much I thought oral tradition was still some kind of cute primitivity. Except, you know, those people who didn't read are juggling so many things with their ears.
and with memory.
And with memory, and the fact that as a storyteller, I am going to deceive you tomorrow. So you better remember what I told you tonight. So you know, so you can pick up if I'm lying to you tomorrow. And just realizing, you know, that there are things your ears will pick up that your eyes won't. The whole idea of the burden of truth is on the listener, right? If all you've read is Western literature.
Yeah, that's very disturbing.
Yeah, well, that too.
Unsettling.
That too. But Western literature buys takes a huge lot of its credence from the idea that you should believe what you read.
A singular truth.
Right.
A
To
singular
the point
truth.
where unreliable narrator is a thing. It's funny, somebody asked me, like, you know, you use a lot of unreliable narrators in your fiction. I'm like, dude, I've not been an unreliable narrator in my entire life. I don't write unreliable narrator. You're supposed to believe what they tell you. But it's again the idea that part of storytelling, part of listening to a story is you have to do some detective work. I'm not just telling you a story, I'm throwing these things in and I'm throwing a ruse here and a little deception here and so on. So you're not just here to hear a story, you're also here to figure out the puzzle. For a bunch of people who don't necessarily have a written language, that's highly sophisticated and complex, and we can't do it.
Almost like, I mean, it's like jazz, improvisation, you know, memory and but how do you, as a novelist, I'm like, how do you even plot this thing? One, because, you know, particularly the trilogy, there are stories about storytelling and about power through storytelling and language. How do you hold it together over not only 700 pages, but then 3 times? Like, what does your wall look like?
My walls look pretty crazy. My wall would be like all of that covered in Post-its.
Wow.
And I can tell when somebody's been in my room because the green Post-its are where the red Post-its should be. I'm like, don't you understand? Over there is like Central Africa. That's West. You can't put the Central Africa Post-it in the West Africa Post-it. So yeah, there is. I do a lot of exhaustive plotting. But the problem is, then you start to write the novel, and characters become people. And they just don't take shit from you anymore. And then, okay, there goes all of that plot. And like, there's so many turns in the new book, for example. If it's surprising to you, it's just as surprising to me. Because I'm like, what the hell did we just get ourselves in now? But characters become people, and people do, you know, people surprise and people disappoint. And those are 2 things you don't necessarily expect people to do. And that's what happens. Yes, I have these carefully laid out plans, and then I have people who become people. I'm like, hey, screw you and your plan. I'm going this way, or I'm going to be a disappointment now, or yeah, so on. And you just, for me as the writer, I just have to sort of let that be, you know, the story.
I'm seeing the 10-minute warning. I want to make sure we talk about female characters. Because one of the things, my favorite characters in your novels are always the female characters.
Me too.
And so, yeah, so on one level, for me, Nina was your essay from Jamaica to Minnesota myself. There are lines in the essay that kind of just resonated with, you know, parts of her story. And so that was kind of interesting to me. So that in novels where queerness or at least gayness was not explicit, or at least not,
Mhm.
kind of dealt with fully, right,
Mhm.
fully explored. Sometimes it's your female characters that
Mhm.
seem to kind of capture, let's not say the autobiographical, but something of the sense, I need to flee Jamaica.
Mhm.
And it's there in Sutherland,
Mhm.
it's there in Lilith, right? And so I'm interested in who's your favorite female character you've written so far, but I'm also interested in sort of they're scrappy,
Mhm.
they're unlikable,
Mhm.
or they have been. Their dialogue, they're really hard.
Mhm.
They've gone through a lot, right?
Yeah.
Sutherland, she's multiple times she said or others say to her, what of your use? You have no use,
Mhm.
right? But in this novel, I felt as if there was so much tenderness
Mhm.
and heart. Like all your earlier novels really kind of put these women through the ringer,
Mhm.
right? Sutherland does too. I mean, from page
Right,
one,
right, yeah.
word one, page one.
Mhm.
But there's so much tenderness, and
Mhm.
that it feels like a
Yeah.
female writer writing female characters. I mean, there's a lot of
Mhm.
what Toni Morrison calls self-regard, but she thinks
Mhm.
about being a woman and the
Mhm.
fate of a woman, the plight of women. Are you explicitly thinking about feminist writing? I know you're influenced by Toni Morrison, but
Yeah,
what goes into
I-
crafting a female character for you?
Well, I mean, I think, for me, the turning point was reading women writers. Elizabeth Nunez, she wrote Bruce Hibiscus, read it. Toni Morrison loved that book. She was my creative writing teacher for a weekend workshop. And she was reading John Crow's Devil, actually, a very, very early draft. And she was like, this is good. There's some good writing here, but you don't have a clue about women. And I was like, listen, I became a Republican senator right there. I was like, I have a mother.
The son of a mother.
Yeah, I have sisters. But it tells me which women are you reading? I think I named two and they were both dead. And she's like, yeah, you're like the millionth male writer who don't read women. And what she was telling, the other thing she was telling me, and I didn't realize this until way after, is that there's certain lessons about writing you can only learn through reading. And I actually think writing characters is one of them. And I learned to write women by reading women writing women. Toni Morrison in particular, and the whole idea, and what Toni Morrison said about self-regard. And I think that's sometimes the difference when when men write women. My friend Catherine Meyer has a feminist book festival in the UK, and one of the most popular panel was "She and Her Breasts Walk In," men writing women. That's an actual line, and I forget who said it. He's a pretty good writer. Well, I don't know if it's good, but famous writers. That was his line. She and her breasts walked in.
In a bag.
Yeah. But I think they what is not there is self-regard. Because I remember saying to her, do you mean I shouldn't have my woman do crazy stuff? She said, oh, keep the crazy stuff. But what I want to do is believe it. And I think that what we have is something Jane Smiley talked about. Says Jane Smiley to me is the first person who brought down the problem with Heart of Darkness in a way which resonated with me. And she said the problem with Heart of Darkness is that Conrad, instead of reflecting, embodying, or even observing the Black people in his story, merely projects his fears and desires on them and then reacted to it. And I thought about that because I see that all the time. Instead of a character, I see a projection of a fear or desire that they reacted to. And when I tried to explain it to my student, I said, think of every female character in every video game ever made, ever. With their 36 double D bosoms, their 15-inch high heels, they have 15 degrees, but they still wear hot pants. I said, and you spend and with that woman, you spend most of your day doing this. So that's not a character, that's a projection of your desire that you're reacting to. And I think that's what, when I realized that it's not a matter of likable or unlikable. Most of my characters are pretty unlikable a lot of the time. To me, that's not even the measure of it. It's because unlikable is fine. It's if you I love hating a character. Oh my God, when I completely hate a character, I want to congratulate the author. I'm like, it's been a while since I've hated somebody as much as I hate your character. Because that's the cardinal says if you're indifferent, that's when you've gone off. That to me is a bad book. When I'm indifferent to it. So I don't have a problem with people hating, can't standing. You know, we haven't talked a lot about violence. If they're horrified by the violence, I'm not good. If they're indifferent, and that's a problem. And that's what I realized. So it's not a matter of unlikable, because a character can be unlikable, but when the book ends, you miss them.
Well, I mean, I was telling you earlier, if you have not read Moon Witch, read it again. I was so in love with the story. I think it was the most immersive character, partly because you had so much time with her, right?
Yeah, it's 177 years. That's a lot.
Yeah, just immersive, and again, you know, she goes through the ringer.
She goes through the ringer,
she has so much heart, and you're so tender, I think, with her.
Yeah, well, because it's 177 years.
Yeah.
She gotta fall in love at some point.
But even you know, this is not Twilight, but there's, you know, interspecies sex and romance. It's a trip. There's flurries. But even your the romance and the love in this particular book. It's you know, yeah, it's a very different Marlon James to me.
Maybe I fell in love or something.
You know, brief history. Even Trapper and Wolf. I mean, they were big hits, right? In the first book. But here, to me, I think, you know, Sutherland and Kermit.
Well, I mean, with them, I was exploring different things, like even grief, which is something I've never written before. Which is saying something for a guy who killed off people a lot in his books.
You might talk about trauma, but here, grief is really
grief
centered.
And actually healing, which I never wrote about before either. And that's the thing about Sutherland. Sutherland has to do a lot of healing. And when she gets to the point where she doesn't have it in her to heal herself, the community comes in and heals her. You know, there's a scene in it where Sutherland's in her bed recovering from really bad trauma, and you know, she opens her eyes and suddenly there are dozens of women in her room, and she didn't know. You know, she saved so many women, and it's all these women who go, you remember the time when you did this, when blah, blah, blah. You know, this would have happened to you if Moon Witch didn't show up. And, you know, and people just step forward. One person said, my mom couldn't leave her bed, so I came because I had to see the Moon Witch. And, you know, she said, and then somebody said, women flying through the trees. No, everybody's saying Moon Witch, that is me. And, but even Sutherland is surprised in a way. I was too. I was like, hey, yeah, but yeah, I think with this book, it's just with her, I knew I was not going to deny her that tennis. Lilith is still, it takes place over a short period of time.
Because we have a scene like that in Night Women. We have actually several scenes like that in Night Women.
But you can't really trust the tenderness in Night Woman.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
You can't trust it. She doesn't. And she's right. She never completely gives herself over. And how can she? You know, whereas in this,
yeah. So what's next for the trilogy? I know you can't tell us very much, but
well, not even my editor.
What's exciting for you in writing? So it might be the next book, or you know, what's ahead? Like, what are you looking forward to exploring on the page?
I mean, I am looking forward to finishing the third one because it now that it goes in a different direction. Well, literally goes in a different direction.
I'm gonna be mad at you. I feel it coming. I feel it.
Yeah, you're probably gonna be mad. I was just saying, whatever allegiance you formed in this book, you probably should consider those. But yeah, I mean, other than that, it's again, somebody else giving a perspective on the story, but not necessarily in reaction to the other two. So there's that. I'm starting to forget how like cars work. So I'm like, man, I need to write a present tense soon. I didn't even know how to describe turning on a car. It's like, how does ignition work again? So it's going to be great to head back to. I mean, even when I'm writing contemporary, I'm not really writing contemporary. I used to bristle at being called a historical novelist, mostly because I don't want any period I've lived through to be called historic, because that's insulting. A book set in the 70s is not a historical novel. But anyway, but at the same time, I do like writing about the past. So it's probably knows.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Marlon. Let's open up to audience questions. There's a mic here, so please come to the mic so that we can capture you for the audience. Do we have questions for Marlon?
You know, I'm a teacher. I'll just point out one here.
Hello. Okay.
Hi.
So I read Book of Night Woman last semester. I'm a VCU kid. And I think one question I always had about it was that these female characters are really like powerful, interesting. Lilith herself kind of reminds me of me in a good way and bad way. And what's it called? And the white people in the book are, of course, like terrible people generally. But I realized there was like no real role for the Black men in the book, which was interesting because when I researched you for a project I had to do, there was like, what's it called? I was like, this is a Black male writer, and there's like all the Black men in this book seem to be kind of bad people essentially, or they just don't have a real role other than like, I think Lilith's uncle. So I was just wondering like why you kind of put in that book, why Black men are such on such like a, why they're like on the back burner so much in that book.
Well, one, because they were put on the back burner in a weird way in slavery. It's about house slaves, and most of the house slaves are women. So there's that. There's just the strategicness of it that the Black men were mostly on the field, and Lilith and the house slaves were almost never on the field, unless as punishment, which is why they weren't there. So the Black men they would have come across are the people who are enforcing slavery. You know, the Johnny Jumpers, if an overseer is lucky to get some sort of promotion. So you know, more often, 9 times out of 10, the Black men would have been the worst. As house slaves, they wouldn't have met the field slaves and so on. So there is that. There's the whole idea of how messed up slave plantation was. Particularly in the Caribbean. Actually, the American was in some ways worse. So I think, you know, so there, a lot of it was that because of who they were, that would have been what they would have encountered. I really wanted to write a novel about house slaves because in Jamaica we still have it as a stigma that you know the Jamaican with heirs or so on. House slave is still used as a negative because they felt the house slave was sort of had it good and helped actually to participate in slavery. That the house slave is, and we said house N-word here as some sign. Yeah.
Jay-Z. Sort of OJ to Jay-Z.
Right. You know, not realizing that you know, a house slave could die at any minute. You know, just because the food was too salty. That in a lot of ways they had to deal with the sort of capricious and really dangerous tempers of the people around it. Because they're right in the right here to get a slap or so on. So yeah, that was why it was such a concentrated world, but also why the men who entered it were people who never mean anybody well.
It's really interesting. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Other question? Don't be shy. When we're waiting for you to formulate your question, I was interested in, since you mentioned the house slaves, earlier you mentioned Tom Jones. Again, a lot of your female characters are interested in reading and writing. Lilith begins, you know, illiterate, and she's like passing by the library and learns to read. Sutherland as well, right? Is there something about the power of writing and reading that you're thinking about across actually all your novels?
Yeah, that may be me. That's probably me, the book nerd, entering all these books. But you know, in Book of Night Woman, Lilith's crisis in a lot of ways is a literary one, because she's reading Joseph Andrews and she's seeing all these men in that book, and she's not encountering any in real life. None of the people are treated, or none of the people have these kind of virtues, and it's the inability to reconcile those two that causes almost a violent sort of crisis for her. Well, it took the end in the violence. But it's my characters. I think my characters always sort of reading Kazam. Struggling in some ways is a kind of a Lilith if slavery didn't happen thing. And she also reads because I really did believe my teachers and it's a reading as power. I learned to read all sorts of ways. I go in my boss's office and he doesn't know I can read upside down. So I knew everything that was going to happen in that office in 2 months because I just scan his desk. It's a good skill. Learn it. I can also read in the mirror quite well. But it was power, and I think Homer talks about the power of reading. That if you read, you get free, and nobody know you're free but you. And it's a tool towards, again, self actualization. I mean, yes, there are other tools, but reading is the one I knew.
Yeah.
And reading is how I got there. So it's the one I write about.
We also talked earlier backstage about Salman Rushdie, who's a good friend of yours.
Yeah.
Was recently attacked for his writing.
Yeah.
How have you processed that, both as a friend and as a writer?
I mean, it was terrible. It was traumatic. It was because I think Salman really thought that era was gone, and I actually think it is. Because this is a new era. This guy is just another version of a Dylan Roof, where I tell people these guys aren't crazy, they're programmed, because you can program yourself. Thank you, internet. It's funny. 2 days after I'm in the airport, that's when I come up to me and go, "You're Marlon James?" I'm like, "Oh God." I was like, "Baby." I was like, "My girl, she loves your books." Then I was like, "You don't like them?" But anyway, and it came and so on. But yeah, it's I gave a speech actually in Arlington a month ago about the threat we have with books. It's I hope it doesn't become a trend where people start to react to these things violently. But again. But it's terrible. He's coming along. I mean, it's a tough road. It's going to be tough. I mean, it was 11 stab wounds. He's still very, very good humored about it. I think deep down he actually really does that, looking like a pirate. But I can only joke about that. But we don't want to feel that we're entering an era where literature is under threat. But 1,651 books were challenged last year. And I don't know. I mean, this election may prove that, maybe the red wave wasn't as big as you think. It seemed to turn into a red tinkle. But but we will see. I think we do have to we really have to defend literature, and as I said, literature is worth fighting for and worth fighting over.
Yeah, and it's part of why the fact that people read, maybe the boyfriends, but at least the girlfriends read your epic books. I mean, that's a positive sign for the future of reading, because we really do need to read more.
Sure, the boyfriends read them too.
Sure, under the covers. We have a question. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, you had mentioned writing for television recently, and I was just wondering what you've noticed or learned about writing and bringing characters to life in a visual medium.
I mean, writing for TV is weird, and I don't necessarily mean that in a good way. Because in TV, so this is what happens in TV, and my experience of TV is that everybody goes, "We love your vision, that's why we brought you on." So they bring you on, and then a committee of 15 people like, "What if we do this? I'm not feeling that. Can we change that?" You know, it would be I know you wrote it for a Black woman, but you know, Julia Roberts really wants to do it. And you go, but it's Harriet Tubman.
Is it Scarlett Johansson
Yeah.
who gets all the?
Yeah, it's like, yeah, and so on. And what if you were blah, 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 and so many cooks get in, and yes, they do spoil the broth. And then they come back. This isn't your vision. This is not what we signed for, but you all were like with your committee of 20 people. So then you write it your way, they want to have it their way doesn't work, and they go back to your way and act as if that was their idea all along. That's pretty much writing for TV. It's strange. It's a very collaborative medium that can work. It's still very hard for a writer. For every writer that makes it in Hollywood, there are 20 who go, you know what? No. Baldwin couldn't do it. Faulkner couldn't do it. But it's interesting in a sense because writing for TV, you're primarily dialogue, and you know, and that has to carry a lot of the story.
Does your kind of work, your childhood, and not even just childhood, you still read comics a lot. So does your exposure to comics, your love for cinema, kind of growing up, does that kind of help you?
Oh, it does, you know, a lot. Certainly, even with writing books, with writing fiction, you know, I'm hugely influenced by cinema. I still am. But that's implying that the average Hollywood executive knows cinema. Yeah. Or they walk into a room and go, yeah, I was thinking Goddard. Like, is that candy? It's like so it depends. It's a weird game. And sometimes you come out on top, sometimes the compromises work. But a lot of times I can see why the stuff that rises to the top are always stubborn people who will, you know, say either my vision or I quit. And that's why we have I May Destroy You or Sopranos, because of an author willing to do what it takes to keep that vision. And I think that's something it's worth fighting for.
Tell us, if you could, maybe to close, about so Michael B. Jordan's name was attached to the film about the Dark Star trilogy.
It's actually, well, right now it's a TV show. We tried film. I realized turning 630 pages into a 2-hour movie was just not going to work. Also, I think, you know, when you're doing a movie, sooner or later somebody comes with it. So, is it PG-13 or R? I was like, are you asking me if it's gonna be, or are you asking is it gonna be gay or not, or something? So I think TV just gives a broader canvas. TV Emmy is not a death threat to TV. It's still a death threat to film. Moonlight was threatened with an NC-17 rating, which is saying something for a film with no sex in it. There's not even any nudity in it, but it was about to get an NC-17 rating, just totally ridiculous. So yeah, that's what we're
It's still on the
oh,
docket.
it's definitely still on the docket.
And is the brief history, was it going to be a TV series?
It's supposed to be a TV series on Netflix. They're in a writer's room now, and we'll see where that goes.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Marlon, for being with us
Thank
tonight.
you.
All the other reasonable questions, and Dr. Hamilton did a good job of covering them. But give them one more round of applause. We'll be upstairs. We'll be signing some books. Our friends from Fountain Bookstore down the street are there, and if you haven't bought a book and you'd like to, now's your opportunity. We'll give our authors a moment to collect themselves, and they'll be right up and be glad to sign whatever copy you have. Thanks again for coming.